It is, but there's some good stuff too. They had their good times, they really did. They had what they call zaharas, and they would get together at their house every night, and they would play the Syrian music, and they would dance, and with a glass on the head, and they had lots of fun. The thing is, they really enjoyed each other, and they were very clannish. All of their social activities were with their own kind, their own cousins. They didn't associate outside their race. I mean, they would do business with other people, but all their socializing were with other Syrians. And it was that way when I was a kid. All our things were with our cousins and stuff. Whenever you have a mining town, especially a boom town, of course there's prostitution. They're almost the first to come. If they can't get jobs as seamstresses or washerwomen or cooks, they go right to prostitution. Well, Dad was all tanked up one night, and this was at a time when my mom and he had gotten back together. It was 1986. And Dad was tanked up. Of course, it was past 6 p.m., so that's a pretty safe bet. And they were out somewhere, and he started telling this story about Uncle Pete and his dad owning a whorehouse. And Mom was embarrassed. She didn't think it was appropriate to be talking like that, especially in public. He was at a bar somewhere. It wasn't. He shouldn't have been doing it, but he was tanked up. What are you going to do? So she didn't believe the story, nor would I. So she waited a few days, and she went over to Aunt Tony's. Now, Aunt Tony was Uncle Pete's wife, and she was the dearest, most honest lady you could ever imagine. She went to church all the time, said novenas, probably never told a lie in her life. And Mom asked her, between the two of us, is there any truth to that story? And Aunt Tony very reluctantly put her head down and said yes. And she said when Sito found out about it, she hit the roof, and she made them get rid of it right away. So they did, and at one point, own a cat house, and it was in Naco. Now, was Jim in on it? I don't have information to that effect, but he probably was to some degree. But you got to remember, we're judging with today's sensibilities and not sensibilities of 100 years ago. It was not shameful then. It's not shameful today to some people. Okay, we're getting close to winding this up, and the most important part is coming. This guy, the one that we're all so indebted to, the one without whom none of us would be here, Jim Itule. I want you to picture a man in his prime out here in this godforsaken land. He doesn't speak much in the way of English. Yes, he's a very good-looking man, but he's not American. He doesn't fit into the ranching scene. The ranchers are not going to let him date their daughters. They're going to let other ranchers' kids date their daughters. He was relegated to frequenting whorehouses. That's how men are. We have to accept that. We can't think of it with today's sensibilities. You have to think about it realistically from that many years ago. Well, apparently poor Jim contracted the worst thing you could have contracted in those days. He got syphilis. And they had limited ways of dealing with it. They did not have the antibiotics to cope with it. I mean, they could give them some relief. I understand they used to put glass tubes inside of them and drain it out, but it was still an awful thing, and I can't even, it's hard to even think about it, but he had it, and it was killing him. It was slowly killing him. His mother, being a medical person, was not miffed by it. She was not embarrassed by it. It was just a bad piece of luck that came his way. Well, eventually it killed him, and he was buried. It was a proper burial in a cemetery, and there were a lot of people in attendance, but oddly enough, after the burial, we didn't hear about Uncle Jim anymore. Nobody would talk about him, because in 10 or 20 years after this happened, it was a disgrace, or it was something to be looked down upon, and yet many prominent men had that disease. Al Capone, not that he was prominent, he was, he is what he was. He had it and died from it. I've heard stories that Abraham Lincoln had it. It was just a virus that some men had the misfortune of catching. Well, Jim died from it, and I have been looking for this man for at least 15 years, but information about him has been very vague, because most of the old-timers don't want to talk about him because of that reason. They wouldn't tell me that was the reason, but I assumed it was, that it was an embarrassment to the family. It wasn't to me, but to them it was, and they just as soon not talk about it. So I spent a lot of time trying to find where he was buried. More time than you can imagine. I tromped through cemetery after cemetery in southeast Arizona. One day we went through, 6 of them? It was unbelievable, and we were reading every tombstone, trying to find this guy. I was trying to find him to thank him for bringing us out here, to pay him honor. And I got so exasperated that I contacted the Mormon Church, because they're very big about genealogy and where people end up, and they tried to help me, and they couldn't. And the lady came and patted me on the back, and she said, "I know you're getting dejected, son." She was about 80 years old. Who else would call me son? And she said, "Don't give up. You're doing God's work. Keep at it." So I left there with new resolve to find this man that I had been looking for so long. So I went to the Mormons and looked through their archives, asked them for help in finding him. They tried to help me. They're very, very earnest, nice people who believe they're doing God's work this way. And she said, "Don't give up." And I left there, and I was on Broadway, not far from Aunt Emily's house. Now, usually when I go get Aunt Emily, I give her 3 or 4 hours notice, because she likes to primp up and look pretty and, have her makeup on. But I said, "Auntie, can I come over right now? I'm not far." She says, "Come on." So I went over, and she had her hair in curlers, and she doesn't like me to see her like that, but we kind of put that aside. I said, "Is there anything you can tell me about Uncle Jim's death, or where he's buried, that you may have forgotten about?" And it was like a little light went on in the back of her head, and she said, "I seem to remember something about Douglas, about him being buried in Douglas and everybody going down there." Well, I had been talking to the man that is the director of the cemetery in Douglas. His name was Pete Robles, and time after time he told me, "The man is not here." And I would find different spellings for Jim's name, Itule, and I'd call this Robles guy, and I'd say, could he be buried under maybe this spelling of his name? "No, he's not here." Well, the son of a bitch was just putting me off. And what I didn't know, and I just found out, was that he was about to retire and didn't want to be bothered to do his job. So I called that day, and I was going to chew him out, because I know he'd been sloughing me off. And it said, when I called, "This number is no longer in order." And I said, "That's impossible. This is a cemetery. It's got to have a number." And it said, "The new number is blah, blah, blah." I get a young man's voice. His name is Stevie a Hispanic last name, very nice young man, and I just sensed that I was going to hit pay dirt. And I explained my situation to him. I said, I have an ancestor. I believe he's laying in your cemetery. I have a great uncle who's there. That would be my Sitho's brother, David Basilla. I know he's there. I said, but Mr. Robles is just not being helpful. I said, is it my imagination, or is this guy just a fucking jerk? And he laughed. He laughed like, yeah, but I can't say that, you know. So he says, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. Call me back in about an hour and a half. I'll see what I can do for you. So I called him back in an hour and a half. No answer. I was dejected. 20 minutes later, the phone rings. It's him. He says, Tom, I found him. He's here. Not only is he here, he lies right next to Uncle Dave. I said, I'm coming. We're all coming. This was a big moment. This was 15 years of searching, finally getting answers. I was so grateful to God that here's this man that we owe so much to. We finally know his resting place. We can go down and grieve, pay our respects, do the proper thing. I said, Stevie, would you do something for me? Would you guide us to the plots? He says, not only will I do that, but I will tie 2 yellow ribbons to the cemetery headstones. So Stevie and I and Donna go down there, and I take a video camera with me, and I tell Stevie, I said, I found him. They're down there, and he's going to tie these ribbons in case it's a pretty good sized cemetery. I said, let's let her find them rather than us find them. Let's let her have the enjoyment of
pretend like you don't know.
But we'll nudge her in the right area. So we're kind of nudging her. All of a sudden she's jumping up. Hallelujah! It's Dave Basilla. We found him. Praise Jesus. You know, she was so excited, and she's going. She's going, Jim's got to be around here somewhere. He's got to be around here somewhere. And I looked at her. I said, you're standing on him. They were married right next to each other. But here's the problem. I looked at the tombstone. I looked at Mr. Basilla's tombstone was completely legible. He died in 1920. Jim died in 1919. Jim's tombstone was completely illegible. We couldn't read one letter on it. Had we walked by it, we would have not known that it was him. Here's a picture of his tombstone. And I'm thinking, as I'm looking at it, that it's weather worn, that the years of snow and rain and wind have worn off the writing, which can happen, but usually it takes 250 years. It takes a long time to do it. My brother, that suspicious little guy that he is, looked at these pictures and he said, Tom, this is not weather. He said, somebody sat down and methodically and angrily chipped away every letter on the face of that tombstone with tremendous anger and tremendous fury. And I looked at it and I looked at it and I had to agree. Somebody else did. There was a tombstone made of the same material right next to it, the same year, and it was perfectly readable. This one was not. Somebody had hatred for this man, and what I think happened was that after he died, his wife found out that she had what he had. It was either her or one of her children. And they went down there and desecrated his headstone. So we are going to replace it with love and with the respect that he is due, despite this little glitch in his headstone. the purpose for this whole thing, I think more than anything, was intended to honor those that brought us not only out west, but out of the old country where so much murder was occurring against the Arab Christians and the Armenians, all of which has been documented. And so we need to be grateful to those that got us out of there. And Jim is among them, of course. And for years we were told that he was, the leader and the one that came out here first. I have recently found that that isn't 100% true. He was one of the first. The first ones that came I will mention in a minute, but more importantly, the fact that when we found his grave and it was desecrated indicated that people were angry at him for having acquired what he did and passing it on to his wife. Now, I've talked to some of my Mexican friends, and the Mexican culture is a relatively new one. It's primarily a mixture of Spanish and Indian blood, and the Indians had peculiar beliefs about the hereafter. And they said to me that in their culture, if you are extremely angry at someone, the desecration of their headstone is the next step that those that feel wrong take. Do I judge him for the sad ending that he had? No, nor should anyone else. He was simply being a man. And as Uncle George said, when you're given something, you're supposed to use it. Because he was an alien and didn't speak much in the way of English, as I mentioned earlier, he was not going to be allowed to socialize with the creme de la creme of Southeast society, so he was relegated to frequenting cat houses, which were plentiful, and they were not the disgrace then that they later became. But that aside, I just want to say thanks to him on behalf of all of the Itules for what he did. Now, the fact remains that he was not the first Syrian out here, and this just came my way a couple of days ago as to who was, and I will relate it to you as I have it. Someone named Abe Ganem, the eldest brother of John Joseph Ganem, was the first known Syrian/Lebanese to come to the Southwest, namely Tucson. Possibly for health reasons. That was very common in those days. People that had arthritis or bursitis, apparently the warm weather helped them. And he came, and he, to my knowledge, was the first of the family, and they were family because Habubo is a Ganem. He came in 1898. He opened a fruit stand near Congress and Church. He apparently maybe left somebody to run it while he went back east to tend to his affairs, probably to liquidate his properties, turn it to cash.